In the autumn of 1887, in a timber town where the law protected money over mothers, a young widow named Clara Brennan drove a kitchen knife into the heart of a man who'd come to take more than what was owed. With her baby's cries still echoing and blood cooling on the floorboards, the sheriff called it murder. But when a wealthy rancher named James Dalton walked into that jailhouse and heard her story, he didn't see a killer, he saw a woman worth defending. What happened next would turn a town against itself and prove that sometimes justice wears spurs and carries a Winchester. This is their story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blood had dried dark between the floorboards by the time Sheriff Raymond Tackett arrived at the Brennan cottage. Clara sat on the porch steps, her daughter Emma clutched tight against her chest, the child's face buried in the torn fabric of her mother's dress. The November wind carried the smell of pine smoke and sawdust from the mill down the hill. But inside the cottage, the air held something heavier. Wendell Cray lay face down on the kitchen floor, the bone handle of Clara's bread knife jutting from between his ribs. His coat was still buttoned, his boots still laced, but his hands, those hands were frozen in claws near his sides, as if death had caught him mid-reach. The sheriff's deputy, a thin man named Porter, stumbled out onto the porch and vomited into the rosemary bush. Clara's late husband had planted 3 springs ago. Tackett followed slowly, his face carved from granite, his eyes giving nothing away. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice flat as a judge's gavel, "you're going to need to come with me." She didn't look up. Her hand moved in slow circles across Emma's back, the motion automatic, maternal, endless. "He said my husband's debt was transferred to me when Thomas died, said I owed him $2,000 or its equivalent." And what equivalent did he mean? Her jaw tightened. It made it plain enough. Tackett's hand rested on the butt of his revolver, not a threat. "Just habit. That's for a jury to decide, ma'am. Not you. Not me." "There won't be a jury," she said quietly. "You know there won't." She was right. Wendell Cray owned half the timber contracts in Ashford and held loans on 1/4 of the homesteads. Men who owed him money sat on the town council. The judge had borrowed $500 just last spring to expand his home. Justice in Ashford had always moved with the current of money, and Clara Brennan had just dammed the stream. They took her in a wagon, Emma still wailing, the sound carrying over the dirt streets like a prayer no one wanted to hear. Women watched from behind curtains, men turned their backs. By the time they reached the jailhouse, the whole town knew. Clara Brennan had killed Wendell Cray, and the reckoning would be swift. Inside the cramped sheriff's office, Tackett sat her down and placed the knife, now cleaned and wrapped in burlap, on the desk between them. Emma had finally quieted, exhausted into sleep against her mother's shoulder. "Tell it from the start," Tackett said. Clara's voice came out steady, though her hands shook. "Thomas died 4 months ago. Lung fever. He'd borrowed from Cray to buy seed and timber rights and promised to pay it back after harvest, but there was no harvest. The fever took him before the wheat came in, and Cray came calling 3 times. The first time he was polite, said he understood my situation, said he'd give me time. The second time he was less polite, said time was coin, and coin was running out. And the third time, her eyes, red-rimmed and raw, finally met his. Third time, he didn't knock. He walked in while I was nursing Emma. He looked at me the way men look at livestock. Said a woman alone couldn't pay a debt in dollars, but there were other currencies a man might accept. Tackett's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. I told him to leave. I asked if I understood what happened to women who couldn't pay their debts in this territory. Said the poorhouse was no place for a baby. Said Emma would be better off in an orphanage while I worked off what I owed in, her voice cracked, in other employment. And then he grabbed my wrist. Said I'd misunderstood him, said he was offering me a business arrangement, partnership, he called it. Said if I was agreeable, the debt would disappear and I could keep the house, keep Emma, keep my dignity. She paused, the word bitter on her tongue. All I had to do was be agreeable whenever he visited. The baby stirred, and Clara adjusted her hold, the gesture so practiced it seemed like breathing. I pulled away. He didn't let go. So I reached for the knife on the cutting board. I'd been slicing bread when he came in, and I told him if he touched me again, I'd use it. Did he let go? He laughed. Said I didn't have the spine. Said women like me soft, church-going, respectable, never did what needed doing when the moment came. Tackett waited. He was wrong. The door to the sheriff's office swung open, and the wind brought in the smell of horses and leather. A man stepped through, tall and broad-shouldered, his coat dusty from the trail. He removed his hat, black felt, expensive, and held it against his chest. His hair was dark, streaked with grey at the temples, and his eyes were the colour of storm clouds over the Bitterroot Mountains. "Sheriff," the man said, his voice low and measured. "I heard you've got Clara Brennan in here." Tackett straightened. "Mr. Dalton, this is official business. James Dalton, owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, a man whose word carried weight even the timber barons couldn't ignore, stepped closer. His gaze moved from the sheriff to Clara, and something softened in his expression when he saw the baby asleep against her. "What's the charge?" Dalton asked. "Murder. Wendell Cray. Stabbed on his own well in her kitchen. Self-defense," Clara said, her voice stronger now, as if the presence of a witness gave her permission to speak the truth louder. "He tried to force himself on me. I defended my child and myself." Dalton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Sheriff, are you planning to lock her up?" "Don't have much choice. Cray's got a family. They're already calling for a trial." "A trial requires evidence of intent," Dalton said. "Seems to me a woman alone with a baby, defending herself from a man twice her size, that's about as clear-cut as self-defense gets." Tackett shook his head. "You know it's not that simple, James. Cray held paper on half this town. Folks are scared. They want someone to answer this." "Then let them be scared," Dalton said, his tone hardening. "But you put that woman and her child in a cell, you're making a choice about what kind of law you serve." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, old friends, perhaps, or old rivals. The line between the two had always been thin in towns like Ashford. Finally, Tackett said, "Even if I wanted to let her go, James, I can't. Cray's brother Milton, he's already sworn out a warrant. Hudge Fenton signed it an hour ago. She's bound for trial, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it." Dalton turned to Clara. "Do you have anyone? Family? Friends who'll stand with you?" She shook her head. "Thomas's people disowned him when he married me. Mine are back in Ohio, and I haven't got the money to send word, even if they'd come." "Then you'll have me," Dalton said. Tackett blinked. "James, I'll post her bail. I'll hire a lawyer. And I'll make damn sure Milton Cray and every other vulture in this town knows that if they come for her, they come through me first." Clara stared at him, disbelief and hope warring in her exhausted face. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." James Dalton looked at the sleeping baby, then back at Clara. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but certain. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and have no one fight for you. And because no woman should have to kill a man to keep her child safe. But if she does, by God, someone ought to stand with her after." He turned back to Tackett and pulled a leather wallet from his coat. "What's the bail?" "There isn't one yet. Judge hasn't set." "Then I'll wait till he does. And when he tries to set it so high no one can pay, you tell him James Dalton's got the cash in hand and a lawyer riding in from Helena." He placed a stack of bills on the desk, more money than Clara had seen in her entire life. "That ought to cover the first month of legal fees and then some." Tackett looked at the money, then at Dalton, then finally at Clara. "You're buying yourself a war, James." Dalton settled his hat back on his head. "Wouldn't be the first." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Clara. "You and your daughter will be safe, Mrs. Brennan. I give you my word." And with that, he stepped out into the cold Montana afternoon, leaving behind a widow, a baby, and the first fragile thread of hope in a town that had long since forgotten what it looked like. Judge Fenton set bail at $500 a fortune meant to keep Clara Brennan locked up until trial. He announced it from his chambers with barely concealed satisfaction, expecting the widow to rot in a cell while the town forgot she'd ever existed. Within the hour, James Dalton walked into the courthouse with the full amount in cash and a receipt signed by 3 witnesses. The judge's face went the color of curdled milk. By sunset, Clara stood on the courthouse steps with Emma bundled against the autumn cold, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. She'd expected to feel relief, but instead a hollow dread settled in her chest. Freedom, she realized, was just another word for exposed. James Dalton waited beside a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 bay horses. He'd loaded the back with supplies, canvas tarps, crates of provisions, a leather satchel that looked like it held documents. When he saw her hesitate, he spoke quietly. "Town's not safe for you tonight, Mrs. Brennan. Cray's brother has been drinking at the Jackknife Saloon since noon, and he's got friends with him. Men who don't think much of the law when it inconveniences them." Clara adjusted Emma's blanket, her fingers numb. "Where would I go? The cottage is all I have. My ranch, 15 miles north, up in the high country. You and the baby can stay in the main house until the trial. I've got men who'll stand watch, and walls thick enough to stop anything short of a cannon." She studied him in the dimming light, this man, who'd paid a stranger's bail, who'd stood between her and the full weight of the town's fury. His face was weathered, carved by wind and years, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Certainty without cruelty. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You said you know what it's like to lose everything, but that doesn't explain why you'd risk your reputation, your standing, for someone you've never met." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains. "My wife Catherine, she died 7 years ago. Fever took her fast, too fast for me to do anything but watch. She was pregnant, lost them both in the same week." His voice didn't waver, but something behind it did. "I had money, land, every resource a man could want, and none of it mattered. I couldn't protect her." Clara felt the weight of his words settle between them. When I heard what happened in your cottage, heard how you fought for your daughter when no one else would—" He shook his head. "I suppose I'm trying to do now what I couldn't do then. Protect someone who deserves it." Emma stirred and let out a small cry. Clara rocked her gently, and the baby quieted. "I'll accept your offer, Mr. Dalton," Clara said, "but I won't be a burden. I can cook, mend, keep a house. I'll earn my keep." "You'll heal," he corrected, "and you'll let yourself breathe without looking over your shoulder every minute. That's all I'm asking." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He helped her into the wagon, and she settled Emma on her lap. The baby's eyes were wide now, watching the world with that unblinking curiosity infants have before they learn fear. As they rolled out of Ashford, Clara looked back once at the cottage she'd shared with Thomas, the home where she'd been a wife and then a widow and finally something else entirely, a woman who'd drawn blood to protect what mattered most. She didn't look back again. The road climbed steadily into the foothills, the wagon wheels crunching over frost-hardened ground. Pine forests rose on either side, their shadows deep and watchful. James drove in silence, his hand steady on the reins, his rifle propped beside him within easy reach. Clara broke the quiet. "Do you think they'll come after me? Before the trial?" Milton Cray's not a patient man. He'll want revenge, and he'll want it loud enough that everyone hears, but he's also a coward. He won't come alone, and he won't come without thinking he's got the advantage. "That's supposed to comfort me?" A faint smile crossed his face. "It means we'll see him coming." They passed a burned-out homestead, its chimney standing like a tombstone against the darkening sky. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What happened there?" "Claimed jumpers. 2 winters ago. Family fought back. Jumpers burned them out." His voice was flat, factual. "Law never found out who did it. Some things in this territory get settled without judges." The implication hung in the air between them. Clara held Emma closer. As full dark settled, they reached a divide where the road split. James took the left fork, and suddenly the forest opened into a high valley cradled between mountain ridges. Lights flickered in the distance, warm, steady, human. "That's the Dalton Ranch," he said. "Been in my family since 1871. My father built the main house with timber he cut himself. I've expanded it some, but the bones are still his." As they drew closer, Clara could make out the sprawling structure, a 2-story ranch house built from hewn logs, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, corrals where horses moved like shadows. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from 2 chimneys. A man emerged from the barn, lantern in hand. He was older, grizzled, with a limp that spoke of old injuries. When he saw the wagon, he raised the lantern higher. "That you, boss?" "It's me, Garrett. Got guests." The man called Garrett moved closer, his eyes widening when he saw Clara and the baby. "Heard about the trouble in town? This the widow?" "Mrs. Brennan and her daughter. They'll be staying in the east guest room. Make sure the hands know they're under my protection, and anyone who's got a problem with that can collect their pay and ride out tonight." Garrett nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll spread the word." James helped Clara down from the wagon, and she stood on solid ground for the first time in hours, her legs unsteady. Emma had fallen asleep again, her small body warm and trusting against Clara's chest. "Come on," James said. "Let's get you both inside." The ranch house smelled of wood smoke and leather, of coffee and pine. The main room was vast, with a stone fireplace tall enough to stand in and furniture built for durability rather than elegance. Antlers hung on the walls, alongside old rifles and a painting of a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. Catherine, Clara realized, James's late wife. A woman in her 50s appeared from a side hallway, wiping her hands on her apron. She had silver hair pulled back in a practical bone and the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who missed nothing. "Mrs. Halstead," James said, "this is Mrs. Clara Brennan and her daughter Emma. They'll be staying with us for a while." Mrs. Halstead's expression softened immediately. "Poor dear, you look half frozen. Come with me. I've got a room ready and a fire going." "You knew we were coming?" Clara asked. "Mr. Dalton sent word ahead this morning. I've been keeping supper warm." She reached out. "Let me take the little one while you get settled." Clara hesitated, but something in the older woman's face, maternal, competent, kind, made her relax. She carefully transferred Emma into Mrs. Halstead's arms, and the baby barely stirred. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Halstead murmured. "How old?" 6 months next week. Perfect age. Old enough to smile. Young enough not to cause too much mischief." She glanced at James. "I'll get them situated. You see the horses." James nodded and disappeared back into the night. Mrs. Halstead led Clara up a wide staircase to the second floor. The east guest room was spacious and warm, with a 4-poster bed covered in quilts, a rocking chair by the window, and a small cradle that looked freshly built. "Mr. Dalton had Garrett make that this afternoon," Mrs. Halstead said, nodding toward the cradle. "Figured the baby would need a proper place to sleep." Clara felt something break loose in her chest, not grief this time, but something closer to gratitude so fierce it hurt. He didn't have to do that. Mr. Dalton does a lot of things he doesn't have to do. That's the kind of man he is. Mrs. Halstead laid Emma gently in the cradle, tucking a soft blanket around her. "Now, you sit. I'll bring up some food, and we'll see about getting you into a hot bath. I don't want to be any trouble." "Hush. You've had more trouble in one day than most folks see in a year. Let someone take care of you for once." Clara sat in the rocking chair, and for the first time since Wendell Cray had walked into her cottage, she allowed herself to simply exist without planning the next move. The room was warm. Emma was safe. And downstairs, a man she barely knew was standing between her and everyone who wanted her dead. Mrs. Halstead returned with a tray. Venison stew, fresh bread, and tea so hot it steamed in the lamplight. Clara ate slowly, tasting each bite, feeling strength return to her limbs. When she finished, Mrs. Halstead took the tray and paused at the door. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch, but you sleep as long as you need. The world can wait." After she left, Clara stood at the window. The valley stretched out below, silver under starlight, peaceful in a way that felt almost impossible. She could see men moving near the barn ranch hands, settling in for the night. Horses being fed, the rhythms of a place where life continued despite the chaos beyond its borders. A knock came at the door, soft and respectful. "Mrs. Brennan?" "It's James." She opened the door. He stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking suddenly uncertain in a way he hadn't before. "Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." "More than I ever expected," she said honestly. Thank you, Mr. Dalton, for all of it. James, he said, if you're going to be under my roof, we can skip the formalities. Then you should call me Clara. He nodded. Clara, get some rest. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the hands and show you around. The lawyer I hired, Benjamin Thorne, he's riding in from Helena the day after tomorrow. He'll want to hear your story. Prepare for trial. And if the trial goes badly, his jaw set. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But you're not facing it alone. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. The men who work for me, they're good. Men, loyal. But if anyone makes you uncomfortable, anyone says something out of line, you tell me immediately. Understood? I will. After he left, Clara checked on Emma, still sleeping. Small fists curled against her cheeks, and then lay down on the bed fully clothed, too exhausted to change. The kilts smelled like lavender and wood smoke. Outside an owl called, low and mournful, and somewhere in the distance a coyote answered. For the first time in months, Clara Brennan slept without nightmares. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee rising from downstairs. Emma was awake, gurgling happily in her cradle, tiny hands reaching for the dust motes, dancing in the light. Clara changed her, nursed her, and then ventured downstairs. The kitchen was enormous, with a cast-iron stove, a long wooden table, and copper pots hanging from hooks. Mrs. Halstead was frying bacon, and James sat at the table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper from Helena. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time, Mrs." Halstead turned. Sit. Breakfast is almost ready. How's the little one?" "Happy for now. She's a good baby, doesn't fuss much unless she's hungry. That's a blessing. I've known some that screamed from dawn till dusk." She slid a plate in front of Clara. "Eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, toast. Eat up. You're too thin." Clara obeyed. And as she ate, James folded the newspaper and leaned back. "Garrett's rounding up the men. I want you to meet them so they know who you are and why you're here. Some of them already heard rumors from town, so it's better they hear the truth from me. Do you think they'll resent me being here? They'll follow my lead, and my lead is that you're a guest who's earned protection." His voice was firm. "Anyone who disagrees can find work elsewhere." After breakfast, they walked outside. The morning was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, and the mountains stood sharp against it. Near the barn, a group of men had gathered, 8 of them, dressed in work clothes, hats pulled low against the sun. Garrett stood at their center, arms crossed. James led Clara forward, Emma in her arms. "Men," James said, his voice carrying easily. "This is Mrs. Clara Brennan and her daughter Emma. They'll be staying with us until some legal trouble gets sorted out. I expect you to treat them with respect, offer help if needed, and keep your mouths shut about their presence here. Anyone in town asks, you don't know anything. Clear?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. One man, young, with red hair and a crooked grin, stepped forward. "We heard what happened, ma'am. Just want you to know. You did right. Man like Cray had it coming." "Finn, that's enough." But Clara shook her head. "It's all right. Thank you." Another man, older and scarred, nodded gravely. "You're safe here, ma'am. Dalton's word is law on this ranch, and he's given it." The men dispersed to their chores, and Garrett lingered. "Boss, we should post watches. If Milton Cray's got any sense, he'll come sniffing around eventually. Already planned. 2 men on rotation night and day. No one gets within a mile of this place without us knowing." Garrett grunted approval and limped off toward the corrals. Clara watched the men work, feeding livestock, mending fences, holding high, and felt something unexpected, a fragile sense of belonging. She didn't know these people, and they didn't know her, but they'd accepted James's word that she mattered. That was more than her own town had given her. James glanced at her. "You all right?" "I think so," she said. "It's strange, feeling safe. I'd almost forgotten what it was like." "Get used to it," he said, "because you're staying safe until this is over. That's a promise." And as the sun climbed higher and Emma lounged at the horses in the distance, Clara Brennan allowed herself to believe him. But 15 miles south, in a smoke-filled saloon in Ashford, Milton Cray slammed his fist on the bar and swore that before the month was out, the widow who'd killed his brother would pay in blood, and the rancher protecting her would learn what happened to men who sided with murderers. The war James Dalton had predicted was coming, and it was coming fast. 3 days passed in a rhythm. Clara hadn't known existed quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons watching the ranch hands work the cattle, evenings by the fire with Emma on her lap. The world beyond the valley felt distant, almost imaginary, as if Ashford and its violence belonged to someone else's life. On the 4th morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of hammering. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and carried Emma downstairs, following the noise to the back of the house, where James stood in his shirt-sleeves, building a crib far sturdier than the cradle upstairs. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Didn't mean to wake. You didn't." Emma did. She settled the baby on her hip. "What are you making?" "A proper crib. The cradle's fine for now, but she'll outgrow it soon enough." He ran his hand along the smooth pine. "Figured you'd want something that'll last." Clara watched him work the way his hands moved with practiced confidence, measuring twice, cutting once, every motion deliberate. There was something meditative about it, as if the work itself mattered more than the result. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know." He glanced at Emma, who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. "But I want to." She sat on a nearby stump, adjusting Emma against her shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why haven't you remarried? A man with your means, your land, surely there've been women interested." His hammer paused mid-swing. For a moment she thought she'd overstepped, but then he set the tool down and faced her. "There have been," he admitted, "widows from town, daughters of neighboring ranchers, good women, all of them. But every time I thought about it, I'd remember Catherine sitting right where you are now, watching me build her a hope chest the summer before we married." His voice was steady, but something beneath it wasn't. "She used to say I built things because I couldn't control much else in the world. That if I could measure and cut and fit pieces together just right, maybe I could make something that wouldn't fall apart." "Did she fill the hope chest?" "Never got the chance. It's still in the attic, empty." He picked up the hammer again. "After she died, I told myself I'd eventually find someone else. That's what people do. They grieve, they heal, they move forward. But moving forward felt like leaving her behind, and I wasn't ready for that." Emma reached for a wood shaving on the ground, and Clara gently redirected her tiny hand. "Thomas used to tell me I thought too much about things that couldn't be changed. He'd say, 'Clara, you can't plow a field by staring at it.' He was practical that way, always moving, always doing. Sounds like a good man. He was. But he was also stubborn, and that stubbornness killed him." She took a breath. The doctor told him to rest, said the fever would break if he stopped working. But Thomas couldn't stop. He had wheat to harvest, debts to pay, a family to provide for. So he worked himself into the ground until his lungs gave out. James set down the cribside he'd been sanding. "You blame him for leaving you." It wasn't a question, and the truth of it hit her harder than she expected. Sometimes, is that terrible? It's honest. He sat on the opposite stump, elbows on his knees. Catherine used to garden every morning. Said it kept her hands busy and her mind quiet. The week before she got sick, I told her she was overdoing it, that she should rest more. She laughed and said pregnant women had been working since the beginning of time, and she wasn't going to be the first one to sit idle just because her back ached. You blame yourself for not insisting. Every day. His grey eyes met hers. If I'd been firmer, if I'd hidden her tools or carried her back inside, maybe she'd have had enough strength left to fight the fever when it came. Clara shifted Emma to her other arm. "We can't live in maybes." "No," he agreed, "but we can sure as hell drown in them if we're not careful." The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the valley. A rooster crowed from the barn, and the ranch began its daily stirring, men calling to each other, horses nickering, the smell of breakfast drifting from the kitchen. "I never told Thomas I was scared," Clara said suddenly. "Not once. He'd ask how I was feeling, and I'd say fine, because that's what he needed to hear. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of being a mother, terrified we wouldn't have enough money, terrified something would go wrong." She looked down at Emma, who'd fallen back asleep against her. "And then, everything did go wrong, and I didn't have the chance to tell him I'd needed him to be scared with me." James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Catherine knew I was scared. I couldn't hide it from her, never could. The night before she went into labor, she held my hand and said, 'Whatever happens, you're going to be fine.' Not, 'We're going to be fine,' just me, like she already knew. Maybe she did. Maybe." He stood and picked up the hammer. "Doesn't make it hurt less." They worked in companionable silence after that James building, Clara watching Emma and occasionally handing him nails or wood pieces when he needed them. The morning stretched long and peaceful, broken only by the rhythmic sound of hammer on nail and the soft cooing of the baby. Mrs. Halstead appeared with a basket of warm biscuits and jam. "Thought you two might be hungry. Hard to build on an empty stomach." Clara took a biscuit gratefully. "These are wonderful. Old family recipe. Catherine loved them." Mrs. Halstead's eyes softened. "She used to sit right where you are, keeping James company while he worked. Sighed she liked watching him build because it was the only time he truly looked peaceful." James glanced up, something unreadable crossing his face. "She told you that?" "More than once." Mrs. Halstead set the basket down. "She also told me that whoever came after her would be a lucky woman, because you were the kind of man who built things to last, not just furniture, but trust, safety, home." She left before either of them could respond. Clara took another bite of biscuit, chewing slowly. "She sounds like she was wise. Too wise for me, that's for sure." James measured another board. "She used to say, I took life too seriously, that I needed to laugh more. So she'd tell terrible jokes just to see if she could crack me. Did it work?" "Every time." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "She'd butcher the punchline on purpose, and I'd laugh anyway. Because watching her try was funnier than any joke." Clara surprised herself by laughing. "Thomas did something similar. He'd sing while he worked, but he couldn't carry a tune to save his life. It was awful, just truly, painfully bad. But he'd sing anyway, loud as you please, and I'd cover my ears and beg him to stop. Did he? Never. Her smile faded. I'd give anything to hear him sing off-key one more time. James set down his tools and crossed to her. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her space, but his presence was solid and grounding. The things we miss about people, they're never the big things, are they? It's the small stuff. The stupid, ordinary, everyday pieces that made them real. No, she agreed. It's never the big things. Emma woke then, fussing, and Clara stood to walk her in small circles, the way she always did when the baby got restless. James watched for a moment, then returned to his work. They fell into an easy pattern. Clara humming softly, James. Building steadily, the morning sun warm on their backs. By noon, the crib was finished. It was beautiful in its simplicity, sturdy oak, smooth joints, carved posts at each corner. James ran his hand over it one final time, checking for splinters. It's perfect, Clara said. It'll do. He lifted it easily, muscles shifting under his shirt. Let's get it upstairs. They carried it together, navigating the narrow staircase, and set it in the corner of Clara's room, where the light from the window would fall soft across it. Mrs. Halstead appeared with fresh linens, soft cotton sheets, and a quilted blanket pieced in blues and yellows. This was for the baby Catherine was carrying, she said quietly, laying the blanket in the crib. She made it herself that spring, sitting by the window, stitching every piece by hand. After she passed, I couldn't bear to look at it. But I think she'd want it used for a child who needed it. Clara's throat tightened. I can't take something that precious. You're not taking it, Mrs. Halstead said firmly. It's being given. There's a difference. James laid Emma in the crib, and the baby stretched, tiny fists opening and closing, before settling into the soft bedding. She looked impossibly small against all that space, but safe, protected by walls built with care and covered by a blanket stitched with love. Thank you, Clara whispered, not sure if she was speaking to James or Mrs. Halstead or Catherine's memory, maybe all three. That afternoon, while Emma napped, James took Clara on a walk around the property. They followed a path through the pines, the air sharp with resin and the sound of wind in the high branches. He showed her the boundaries of his land, 6,000 acres of valley and mountain, creek and meadow. My father staked this claim in 71, right after the railroad came through. Everyone said he was crazy, that the land was too rough, the winters too hard, but he saw what it could become. James paused at a overlook where the entire valley spread below them. He died before he could see it prosper, but he taught me enough to keep it going. Do you ever wish you'd done something else? Clara asked. Gone east, lived in a city, had an easier life. Every winter. He admitted with a slight smile, but then spring comes, and I remember why I stay. They walked further, and he pointed out landmarks, the meadow where he ran his best cattle, the ridge where eagles nested, the creek that never ran dry even in drought years. He spoke about the land the way some men spoke about religion, with reverence and devotion. After Catherine died, he said, this place was the only thing that made sense. I could control the herd, the fences, the hay. I couldn't control death or grief or time, but I could control whether the south pasture got irrigated or whether the barn needed new shingles. Is that why you helped me? Clara asked. Because you couldn't control what happened to Catherine, but you could control what happened to me? He stopped walking and turned to face her. Maybe at first, But not anymore. What changed? You did. You're not a stand-in for someone I lost. He struggled for the words. You're someone who fought like hell to protect what mattered, and that kind of courage deserves protecting in return. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. When I stabbed Wendell Cray, she said slowly, I didn't think about courage. I thought about Emma. I thought about what he'd do to her if I didn't stop him. And then my hand moved, and the knife was in him, and he was falling, and all I could think was, what have I done? You survived. I killed a man. You defended your child. There's a difference. She looked up at him. This rancher who'd given her shelter and safety, who'd built her daughter a crib and stood between her and a town that wanted her hanged. Do you really believe that? With everything too. They stood on the ridge as the first drops of rain began to fall, light and cold, tapping against the pine needles. James took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders without asking. It smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else, something that reminded her of safety. We should head back, he said. Storm's coming in fast. They walked in silence, but it was a different silence than before, warmer, closer, threaded with understanding. By the time they reached the house, the rain was falling steady, and Mrs. Halstead met them at the door with towels and fresh coffee. Emma was still sleeping, her small chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Clara stood by the crib, watching her daughter dream, and felt James come up beside her. She's got your eyes, he said, and Thomas's stubborn chin. That's a dangerous combination. Clara smiled despite herself. Probably. James turned to leave, then paused at the door. Clara? Yes. I'm glad you're here. Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the edge of the crib Catherine had never gotten to use, wrapped in a coat that didn't belong to her, but somehow felt like it might. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the valley clean. And inside, in a room filled with borrowed safety and unexpected grace, Clara Brennan finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved both. The next morning, a rider appeared on the horizon. Mrs. Halstead spotted him first and called James from the barn. He came running, rifle in hand, but as the rider drew closer, he relaxed. It's Benjamin Thorne, the lawyer from Helena. Clara, who'd been feeding Emma on the porch, felt her stomach drop. The lawyer's arrival meant the trial was real, that the sanctuary of the ranch was temporary, that eventually she'd have to return to Ashford and face judgment. James glanced at her and read the fear on her face. He's here to help. That's all. Benjamin Thorne dismounted, a tall, thin man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He removed his hat and bowed slightly to Clara. Mrs. Brennan, I've come a long way to hear your story. But before we begin, I want you to know something. What's that? I don't defend guilty people. I defend people who've been wronged by a system that confuses law with justice. From what Mr. Dalton has told me, you're the latter. So let's make sure the court sees it that way too. He set his saddlebag on the porch and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Now, let's start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. Clara looked at James, who nodded encouragement. Then she looked down at Emma, who was reaching for her mother's finger with complete trust. And she began to tell the story, all of it, knowing that the wounds she was about to reveal might be the only thing standing between her daughter and an orphanage. The truth, she realized, was the only weapon she had left, and she intended to use it. Benjamin Thorne spent 3 days taking Clara's testimony, writing everything in his meticulous hand dates, times, witnesses, every word Wendell Cray had spoken before she'd driven the knife home. He interviewed Mrs. Halstead about Clara's demeanor when she arrived. He questioned James about what he'd seen in the town square. He even rode into Ashford to examine the cottage where it happened, measuring the kitchen, noting the placement of the cutting board, documenting the blood that still stained the floorboards. On the 4th day, he sat Clara down in James's study and delivered his assessment. "The prosecution will argue premeditation," Thorne said, his voice clinical. "They'll say you lured Cray to your home with the intention of killing him to escape your debt. They'll paint you as desperate, calculating, dangerous." Clara's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair. "That's not what happened, I know, but truth and legal strategy aren't always the same thing." He flipped through his notes. "We have several problems. First, there were no witnesses to the actual attack. Second, Cray's family has hired Silas Vance, the most expensive prosecutor in the territory. Third, public sentiment in Ashford is split, and the people who support you are too afraid of the Cray family to testify. So I'm going to hang, not if I can help it." Thorne leaned forward. "But we need more than your word against a dead man's reputation. We need evidence that Wendell Cray was the kind of man who would do exactly what you said he did." James, who'd been standing by the window, turned. "What kind of evidence?" "Other women. If Cray had a pattern of this behavior, it establishes credibility. If we can find even one other woman willing to testify that he propositioned her, threatened her, or worse, it changes everything." Clara felt a cold weight settle in her chest. "You want me to ask other women to relive their trauma, to save my life?" "I want to give you a fighting chance," Thorne said quietly. "But yes, that's what it will take." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Emma was asleep upstairs, innocent and oblivious to the fact that her mother's life hung on the testimony of strangers who had every reason to stay silent. James spoke first. "I'll go to Ashford," quietly. "I know people who owe me favors, people who might know something." "That's dangerous," Clara said. "Milton Cray has half the town looking for reasons to come after you. Then I'll be careful." He looked at Thorne. "How much time do we have?" "Trial's set for 3 weeks from today. I need depositions within 2 weeks if we're going to submit them to the court. Then we don't have time to waste." James grabbed his coat from the hook. "Garrett can manage the ranch. I'll leave tonight." Clara stood. "I should come with you. These women, if they exist, they'll be more likely to talk to me than to you." "Absolutely not," James said. "You set foot in Ashford, and Milton will have you arrested on some trumped-up charge before sunrise." "He's right," Thorne added. "You need to stay here, stay safe, and let us handle the investigation." Clara wanted to argue, but she knew they were right. Still, the helplessness gnawed at her, the idea that her fate rested in other people's hands, that all she could do was wait and hope. James left that night under a moonless sky, his saddlebags packed with supplies and his rifle loaded. Clara watched from the porch until his silhouette disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the forest. Mrs. Halstead came up beside her, a shawl over her shoulders. "He'll be all right," the older woman said. "Mr. Dalton knows how to move through the world without being seen when he needs to." "I hate this," Clara whispered. I hate that he's risking himself for me. I hate that I can't do anything but wait. Waiting is its own kind of courage. Don't discount it. The next 2 days crawled by. Clara kept herself busy with Emma, with mending, with helping Mrs. Halstead prepare meals for the ranch hands. But every sound made her jump, every horse's whinny, every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the shutters. On the third night, Garrett burst through the front door, his face grim. "Mrs. Brennan, you need to get upstairs. Now." Clara's heart stopped. "What's wrong?" "Riders. Coming fast from the south. Could be nothing. But I'm not taking chances." He turned to one of the younger hands, a man named Coop. "Get the rifles. Wake the others. And someone douse the lamps, make the house look empty." Clara ran upstairs, scooped Emma from the crib, and pressed herself against the wall beside the window. Below, the ranch erupted into controlled chaos, men taking positions behind cover, rifles glinting in the starlight, horses being led into the barn to keep them quiet. Through a crack in the curtains, Clara saw them. 6 riders, torches held high, moving up the valley road like a wave of fire. At their head rode a man she recognized even from this distance. Milton Cray, his face twisted with rage and righteousness. They stopped at the edge of the property, just beyond rifle range. One of them shouted, his voice carrying across the night, "James Dalton, we know you're hiding a murderer. Send her out, and we'll let you keep your land and your reputation." Garrett stepped out onto the porch, shotgun cradled in his arms. "Mr. Dalton's not here, and even if he was, you'd get the same answer. Get off this property, or we'll defend it." Milton spurred his horse forward a few steps. "That woman killed my brother in cold blood. She's going to pay, with or without a trial." "She's got a trial scheduled," Garrett called back. "Let the law handle it. The law's been bought by Dalton's money. Everyone knows it." Milton gestured to his men. "We're not leaving without her." One of the riders fired a shot into the air, a challenge, a warning. The ranch hands responded immediately, rifles rising, a wall of steel and resolve. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. Emma, sensing her mother's fear, began to whimper. Clara held her close, whispering soothing nonsense words, her mind racing. If they attacked, people would die. Garrett, the hands, maybe even Emma if a stray bullet found its way inside. She couldn't let that happen. Before she could think it through, Clara handed Emma to Mrs. Halstead, who'd appeared silently at the door. "Keep her safe, no matter what." "What are you doing?" Mrs. Halstead hissed, "Ending this before someone gets killed." She ran downstairs and out onto the porch before anyone could stop her. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and sharp. 6 rifles swung toward her, and she forced herself to stand tall. "I'm Clara Brennan," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "You want me? Here I am, but you leave these men alone. This is between us." Milton's face split into a vicious grin. "Well, well, the widow's spine after all." Garrett grabbed her arm. "Get back inside. Now." She shook him off. "How many men are you willing to sacrifice, Mr. Cray? Because these ranch hands will fight. And when James Dalton comes back and finds his people dead because of me, do you really think you'll live to see the morning?" The certainty in her voice gave Milton pause. He glanced at his men, rough types, hired guns, not the kind willing to die for another man's vendetta. "You're coming with us," Milton said. "Right now." "No." The voice came from the darkness to the left of the house. James Dalton stepped into the torchlight, rifle in hand, his face hard as granite. "She's not going anywhere." Milton's horse shied at the sudden appearance. "Dalton, I should have known you'd slink back. You should have known a lot of things." James moved forward slowly, deliberately, like the fact that I've spent the last 3 days talking to women in Ashford, women your brother terrorized, women he threatened, coerced, and assaulted. I've got 5 sworn statements saying Wendell Cray was a predator, and I've got witnesses willing to testify in court. The color drained from Milton's face. "You're lying." "Am I?" James reached into his coat and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Margaret Hollis says your brother cornered her in the feed store and told her she could pay off her husband's debt in trade. Ruth Canfield says he followed her home one night and tried to force his way inside. Dorothy Pine says he got her alone during a church social and made it clear what would happen if she didn't cooperate. Those women are liars. All 5 of them? All telling the same story." James's voice cut like a blade. "Your brother was a predator, Milton, and Clara Brennan was the first woman brave enough to stop him." One of the hired guns shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Another muttered something under his breath. The unity of Milton's group was cracking. "This doesn't change anything," Milton snarled, but his voice had lost its conviction. "She still killed him in self-defense. Which means when this goes to trial, she'll walk free, and you'll be left with the knowledge that your brother died because he couldn't keep his hands to himself." James raised his rifle slightly. "Now, you can ride back to town and let the law do its work. Or you can try to take her by force, and we'll see how many of your men are willing to die for your family's pride." The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Clara held her breath, waiting for the world to explode into gunfire. Then one of the hired guns turned his horse. "I didn't sign on for this, Cray. Find yourself another fool." He rode off into the darkness. Another followed, then another. Within moments, Milton sat alone on his horse, rage and humiliation warring on his face. "This isn't over," he spat. "Yes," James said quietly. "It is." Milton jerked his reins and galloped away, swallowed by the night. The remaining torches flickered and died, leaving only starlight and the ragged sound of everyone's breathing. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, shaking. James handed his rifle to Garrett and knelt beside her. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said. But there was no anger in his voice, only something that sounded like awe. "I couldn't let them hurt your people because of me. They're your people too now." He helped her to her feet. "Come on, let's get you inside." Mrs. Halstead met them at the door, Emma crying in her arms. Clara took her daughter and held her tight, feeling the baby's heartbeat against her own. The terror was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. James turned to Garrett. "Double the watch. I don't trust Milton to stay away." "Already on it, boss." The house slowly returned to normal, lamps relit, rifles put away, men settling back into their bunks. But something had changed. The ranch. Hans looked at Clara differently now, not as a burden to protect, but as someone who'd stood with them. Upstairs, Clara nursed Emma by lamplight, her hands finally steady. James appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Can I come in? Please." He sat in the rocking chair, exhaustion written in every line of his face. "I met those women in Ashford. Margaret, Ruth, Dorothy, all of them. They were terrified, Clara, terrified of speaking up, terrified of being blamed, terrified of what people would say. But they did it anyway, because of you. They said if you had the courage to fight back, they could at least find the courage to speak the truth. He rubbed his face. You've given them something they thought they'd lost. What's that? Hope that the world might actually punish men like Wendell Cray instead of rewarding them. Emma finished nursing and fell asleep, milk-drunk and peaceful. Clara laid her gently in the crib, covering her with Catherine's quilt. "Thank you," Clara said, softly, "for finding them, for bringing their stories into the light. It's not over yet. We still have to convince a jury, but now we have a chance." James stood and moved to the door. "You were brave tonight. Foolish, but brave. I learned from the best." He smiled a real smile, warm and genuine. "Get some rest. We've got a long road ahead." After he left, Clara stood by the window, looking out at the valley bathed in starlight. Somewhere out there, Milton Cray was plotting his next move. Somewhere out there, women were preparing to testify against a dead man. And somewhere in the balance between justice and vengeance, her fate hung like a leaf in the wind. But tonight, she was alive, Emma was safe, and the man who'd built them a crib and stood between them and the world was still standing. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but tonight, that was enough. The next morning, Benjamin Thorne read through the depositions James had collected, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up at Clara with something that might have been respect. "This changes everything," he said. "With these testimonies, we can argue a pattern of behavior. We can show that Wendell Cray was a known threat, that your actions were reasonable given his history." "Will it be enough?" Clara asked. "It'll have to be." Thorne closed his notebook. "Because in 3 weeks, we're walking into that courtroom, and we're going to make them see the truth, that you're not a murderer. You're a survivor." Clara looked down at her hands, the same hands that had held a knife, that had taken a life, that now held her daughter every day and promised her safety. "Then let's make sure they believe it," she said. And in that moment, sitting in James Dalton's study with morning light streaming through the windows, Clara Brennan stopped being afraid of the trial. She started preparing to win it. The morning of the trial arrived cold and clear, frost glittering on the valley grass like broken glass. Clara dressed in the one good dress Mrs. Halstead had altered to fit her dark blue wool, respectably and sombre. She braided her hair and pinned it tight, then stood before the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 3 weeks ago she'd been a frightened widow in a blood-stained kitchen. Now she was something else, something harder, forged by necessity and desperation. Emma foused in the crib, and Clara lifted her, pressing her face against her daughter's soft hair. "Mama has to go away today," she whispered. "But I'm coming back. I promise." Mrs. Halstead appeared in the doorway, eyes red-rimmed. "The wagon's ready. James is waiting." They'd agreed that Emma would stay at the ranch. Courtrooms were no place for babies, and Clara couldn't bear the thought of her daughter witnessing what was about to happen. She handed Emma to Mrs. Halstead, and the older woman's arms closed around the child with fierce protectiveness. "We'll be here when you get back," Mrs. Halstead said. "All of us." The ride to Ashford took 3 hours. James drove the wagon, while Garrett and 2 other ranch hands, Finn and a grizzled man named Moss, rode alongside as escorts. Benjamin Thorne had gone ahead the night before to make final preparations. The forest pressed close on either side of the road, shadows deep and watching. Clara sat rigid in the wagon bed, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. James glanced back at her more than once, but said nothing. What was there to say? By nightfall, she'd either be free or condemned. As they descended into the valley where Ashford sat, Clara saw the town spread below wooden buildings clustered around a main street, church steeple rising white against the mountains. The mill's smoke drifting lazy into the sky. It looked peaceful, ordinary, like a place where nothing terrible could happen. But Clara knew better. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a two-story brick building with tall windows and a bell tower. A crowd had already gathered on the steps, townspeople come to witness justice or vengeance or whatever they decided this was. Clara spotted faces she recognized. The grocer who'd extended her credit after Thomas died, the minister who'd presided over the funeral, women who'd once smiled at her in church and now looked away. James helped her down from the wagon. "Stay close to me. Don't react to anything they say." They pushed through the crowd, Garrett and the others forming a protective wall around her. Someone spat. Someone else called her a murderer. A woman she'd thought was a friend turned her back deliberately. Clara kept her eyes forward and climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and fear. Benches stretched in rows, already filling with spectators. The judge's bench loomed at the front, empty for now. To the left sat the prosecution's table where Silas Vance, a silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who'd never lost, arranged his papers with meticulous care. To the right, Benjamin Thorne waited, his own materials spread before him. Clara took her seat beside Thorne. James sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a shield at her back. The bailiff entered. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Isaiah Blackwell." Judge Blackwell was a stern-faced man in his 60s, his beard iron gray, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He settled into his chair and surveyed the courtroom with obvious displeasure at the crowd. "This is a court of law, not a spectacle," he announced. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Is that clear?" Murmurs of assent rippled through the room. "Good. Bailiff, bring in the jury." 12 men filed in, ranchers, merchants, a blacksmith, a banker. All of them knew who Wendell Cray had been. All of them knew his family's power. Clara studied their faces and saw little hope there. Judge Blackwell struck his gavel. "The territory of Montana versus Clara Brennan, charged with the murder of Wendell Cray. Mr. Vance, your opening statement." Silas Vance rose smoothly, buttoning his coat. He was a performer, Clara realized, and the courtroom was his stage. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice resonant and commanding, "the facts of this case are simple. On the afternoon of November 7th, 1887, Wendell Cray, a respected businessman, a PR of this community, went to the home of Clara Brennan to collect a legitimate debt. He never left that home alive. Mrs. Brennan stabbed him in the back with a kitchen knife and then sat calmly on her porch waiting for the sheriff to arrive. He posed, letting the image sink in. The defense will try to convince you that this was self-defense, that Mr. Cray somehow threatened Mrs. Brennan. But ask yourselves, where is the proof? There were no witnesses. There are no marks on Mrs. Brennan suggesting a struggle. There is only a dead man with a knife in his back and a woman who admits to putting it there. Vance walked slowly in front of the jury box. Mrs. Brennan owed Mr. Cray $2,000 money her late husband borrowed and failed to repay. That debt became her burden. And rather than honor it, rather than face her obligations like a civilized person, she chose murder. She chose to eliminate the man who held her debt, thinking she could claim self-defense and walk free. He turned to face Clara, and his eyes were cold. Don't let her tears fool you. Don't let her child soften your judgment. A murderer is a murderer, regardless of gender or circumstance, and justice demands that she pay for what she did. Vance sat down. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Blackwell struck his gavel. Mr. Thorne, your opening statement. Benjamin Thorne stood, and where Vance had been theatrical, Thorne was precise, a surgeon instead of a showman. Gentlemen, Mr. Vance is correct about one thing. Clara Brennan did kill Wendell Cray. She has never denied it. But the question before you is not whether she killed him. The question is, why? He moved to stand beside Clara, resting a hand on the back of her chair. Mrs. Brennan is a widow, a mother, a woman trying to survive in a world that offers women like her very few options. When Wendell Cray came to her home that day, he didn't come simply to collect a debt. He came to collect her. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Blackwell's gavel cracked again. Order. The defense will present testimony from multiple women, women of good character, women with no reason to lie, who will tell you that Wendell Cray had a pattern of predatory behavior. He targeted women in vulnerable positions. He leveraged their desperation, and he made it clear that there were alternative ways to settle debts. Thorne's voice hardened. Mrs. Brennan fought back. She defended herself and her child from a man twice her size who made his intentions brutally clear. That is not murder, gentlemen. That is survival. And if we live in a territory where women are condemned for surviving, then we've already lost whatever claim we had to civilization. He returned to his seat. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Blackwell shuffled his papers. Mr. Vance, call your first witness. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. Vance called Sheriff Tackett, who testified about finding Cray's body. He called the doctor who'd examined the corpse, who stated that the knife wound had been fatal and struck from behind. He called Milton Cray, who testified that his brother had been a generous man, a good man, someone who'd helped countless families in Ashford. On cross-examination, Thorne picked at the edges. He got Tackett to admit there was no sign of forced entry, meaning Cray had entered Clara's home uninvited. He got the doctor to acknowledge that the angle of the wound was consistent with someone defending themselves. And when Milton took the stand, Thorne's questions turned sharp. Mr. Cray, you testified that your brother was generous. Is it true he held loans on nearly 40% of the properties in Ashford? He was a businessman. Yes or no, please. Yes. And is it true that several of those loans were in default at the time of his death? Milton's jaw clenched. Some, yes. How did your brother typically handle defaults? He worked with people, gave them time. Did he ever propose alternative arrangements? Non-monetary settlements? Vance shot to his feet. Objection. Speculation. I'll rephrase. Thorne said smoothly, Mr. Cray, are you aware of any instances where your brother accepted goods or services in lieu of cash payment? Milton hesitated too long. I don't know the details of every transaction, because if he did accept such arrangements, it might suggest a pattern, wouldn't it? A pattern of leveraging desperation? Objection. Vance's voice cracked like a whip. Sustained, Judge Blackwell said. Move on, Mr. Thorne. But the seed was planted. Clara saw it in the jury's faces, doubt, the smallest crack in the prosecution's narrative. The afternoon brought Thorne's witnesses. Margaret Hollis took the stand first, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. She was a small woman, prematurely grey, with the worn look of someone who'd survived hard years. "Mrs. Hollis," Thorne said gently, "can you tell the jury about your interaction with Wendell Cray in June of this year?" She spoke quietly, but her words carried. "My husband died 2 years ago. Left me with debts I couldn't pay. Mr. Cray held the note on our store. He came to see me one evening, after I'd closed. Said he understood my situation, said he could help. What did he propose? He said if I was amenable to certain arrangements, he could forgive the debt, make it disappear." Her voice broke. He said a woman alone had assets beyond money, and he was willing to negotiate. "What did you do?" I told him no. I sold everything I owned and paid him every penny. But I've heard stories other women who weren't as fortunate. Vance's cross-examination was brutal, but Margaret held firm. When she stepped down, Clara saw tears on her face and respect in the jury box. Ruth Canfield testified next, then Dorothy Pine. Each told similar stories, Wendell Cray approaching them when they were vulnerable, making offers that were threats dressed as generosity, making it clear what would happen if they refused. By the time the third woman finished, the jury wasn't looking at Milton anymore. They were looking at the empty chair where Wendell Cray should have been sitting. Finally, Thorne called Clara to the stand. She stood on legs that barely supported her and crossed to the witness box. The bailiff held out a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Thorne approached her with a gentle expression. "Mrs. Brennan, please tell the jury what happened on November 7th. Clara took a breath and began. She told them about Thomas's death, about the debt, about Cray's visits. She described the afternoon he'd come to her home, the way he'd looked at her while she nursed Emma, the words he'd used that made his intentions unmistakable. "He grabbed my wrist," she said, her voice steady. "He said I was wasting time, pretending to be respectable when everyone knew what widows had to do to survive. He said Emma would be better off in an orphanage where she'd be fed and clothed, and I'd be better off accepting reality." What reality was that? That I belonged to him now? That the debt made me his property? The courtroom was absolutely silent. When he reached for me again, I grabbed the knife. I told him to leave. He laughed. He said I didn't have the courage to use it. She looked directly at the jury. He was wrong. Vance's cross-examination was vicious. He attacked her character, questioned why she hadn't screamed for help, suggested she'd invented the assault to justify murder. But Clara didn't break. Every question she answered calmly, firmly, looking each juror in the eye. When it was over, Judge Blackwell called for closing arguments. Vance stood and delivered a passionate plea for justice, for the sanctity of law, for the principle that killing could never be justified by accusations against the dead. Then Thorne rose. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply told the truth. "Gentlemen, you've heard from 4 women today. 4 women who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward. They've told you about Wendell Cray's pattern of predation. They've shown you that Clara Brennan's story isn't an isolated incident. It's the culmination of years of abuse that this community chose to ignore." He paused, letting his words settle. Mrs. Brennan could have stayed silent. She could have submitted. She could have sacrificed her dignity and her daughter's future to satisfy a debt she didn't create. Instead, she fought. And now you must decide, will you punish her for surviving, or will you acknowledge that she did what any parent would do, what any of you would do to protect their child? The jury retired to deliberate. Clara sat with James in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, unable to eat the food Mrs. Halstead had packed, unable to do anything but wait. "However this goes," James said quietly, "you fought. That matters. Does it? If they find me guilty, they won't. You can't know that." He took her hand, and she let him. "I know that 12 men heard the truth today, and I have to believe that matters." 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun was setting when the bailiff finally called them back. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Judge Blackwell took his seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a rancher, Clara, had never met, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" The pause lasted forever. Clara felt James's hand tighten around hers. "We find the defendant, Clara Brennan, not guilty by reason of self-defense." The courtroom exploded. Shouts, cheers, angry protests, cows erupting from every corner. Judge Blackwell's gavel cracked again and again, but it couldn't contain the storm. Clara couldn't breathe. Not guilty. Free. Emma. James pulled her into an embrace, and she felt tears on both their faces. Benjamin Thorne shook her hand, grinning wider than she'd thought possible. Mrs. Halstead appeared from somewhere in the crowd, weeping openly. But through it all, Clara saw Milton Cray standing at the back of the courtroom, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. His eyes locked on hers, and she saw the promise there. This wasn't over. They left through a side door to avoid the crowd. But as they reached the wagon, Milton appeared with 3 men, not hired guns this time, but family, his cousins, his uncle, men who shared his blood and his fury. "This isn't justice," Milton roared. "She murdered him, and you all know it." James stepped between them. "The jury has spoken. It's done." "Nothing's done." Milton's hand dropped to his gun. "She killed my brother, and she's going to—" The shot rang out before anyone could react. But it wasn't Milton who fired. It was his cousin, a young man barely 20, drunk on rage and family loyalty. The bullet struck James in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Clara screamed. Garrett and the ranch hands drew their weapons, but Milton's group scattered, melting into the crowd. James hit the ground hard, blood spreading across his shirt. Clara dropped beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. "Stay with me, James, stay with me." His eyes found hers, unfocused but aware. "I'm all right. Just get me home." They loaded him into the wagon, and Clara climbed up beside him, her hands slick with his blood. As Garrett drove them out of Ashford at a gallop, Clara looked back once and saw the town receding into darkness. She was free. But the man who'd freed her was bleeding in her arms, and she realized that some victories came at costs too terrible to measure. The wagon clattered through the darkness, every rut in the road halting James's wounded shoulder and drawing a sharp breath through his clenched teeth. Clara knelt beside him in the wagon bed, her hands pressed against the blood-soaked bandage Garrett had fashioned from his own shirt. The cloth was already saturated, warm and sticky beneath her fingers. "How much further?" she called Garrett. 10 minutes, maybe less." His voice was tight with worry. James's eyes flickered open, unfocused. "Emma, she's safe. Mrs. Halstead has her." Clara smoothed the hair back from his forehead. His skin was clammy, too pale in the moonlight. "Save your strength. Don't talk." "Bossy," he managed, the ghost of a smile touching his lips before pain wiped it away. When they finally reached the ranch, every lamp in the house blazed. Mrs. Halstead stood on the porch, and the moment she saw James being carried from the wagon by Garrett and Finn, her face went white. "Get him to his room. Moss, ride for Doc Emerson in Pine Ridge. Tell him it's urgent. Coop, boil water and bring every clean cloth we have." The men carried James upstairs to his bedroom, a place Clara had never entered. It was sparsely practical. A large bed with a simple quilt, a dresser, a chair by the window. Nothing decorative, except a small photograph. On the nightstand, James and Catherine on their wedding day, both young and unbearably hopeful. They laid him on the bed. His shirt was ruined, the fabric stiff with dried blood. Clara reached for the buttons with shaking hands. Mrs. Halstead appeared beside her. "I'll do this. You go check on Emma." "No." Clara's voice was firm. "He took that bullet because of me. I'm not leaving him." The older woman studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you do exactly as I say." Together they cut away James's shirt. The bullet had entered high on his intention. Left shoulder, just below the collarbone. The wound was ugly torn flesh, blood still seeping steadily. Mrs. Halstead examined it with experienced eyes. "Bullet's still in there. We'll need the doctor to remove it, but we can stop the bleeding for now." She handed Clara a stack of clean cloths. "Press here, firm and steady. Don't let up." Clara obeyed, pushing down against the wound. James groaned, his back arching off the bed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." His hand found hers, the one not pressed against his shoulder, and gripped it weakly. "Not your fault. It is. If I hadn't come out onto those courthouse steps, then they would have burned the ranch, or worse." His breathing was labored. "You did what had to be done." Mrs. Halstead returned with hot water and began cleaning around the wound. "That cousin of Milton's, Caleb, he always was a hot-headed fool. Doubt even meant to hit you specifically. Probably just fired blind out of rage. Doesn't matter what he meant," James said. "Matters what he did." The next 2 hours were the longest of Clara's life. She maintained pressure on the wound while Mrs. Halstead worked, washing away blood, checking for signs of infection, keeping James conscious with sharp questions and occasional sips of whiskey. "Somewhere in the house," Emma cried, and Clara's heart pulled toward her daughter, but she didn't move. Finally, hoofbeats sounded outside. Doc Emerson arrived, a gray-haired man with steady hands and no-nonsense eyes. He took one look at the wound and began unpacking his instruments. "Mrs. Halstead, I need more light." "And you," he nodded at Clara, "if you're staying, you'll assist. Can you do that without fainting?" Clara thought of the knife entering Wendell Cray's body, of his blood on her hands. "I can." "Good. Hold this lamp. Keep it steady no matter what happens." The surgery took an hour. Clara held the lamp while Doc Emerson probed the wound, found the bullet lodged against bone, and extracted it with careful precision. James bit down on a leather strap and made sounds that would haunt Clara's dreams, but he didn't scream. When it was finally over, Doc Emerson dropped the bullet into a tin cup with a sharp clink. "Clean wound, all things considered. No major vessels hit. He'll heal if infection doesn't set in." He began stitching. "Someone needs to watch him constantly for the next 3 days. Change the dressing twice daily. Keep the wound clean. And if he develops a fever, send it to me immediately." "I'll watch him," Clara said. Doc Emerson glanced at her. "You'll need to sleep." "I'll sleep when he's out of danger." The doctor finished his stitches and bandaged the shoulder with professional efficiency. He's lucky. 2 inches lower, that bullet hits his lung. 2 inches right, it severs an artery. He won't be using that arm much for weeks, but he'll live. After Doc Emerson left, the house fell into exhausted quiet. Mrs. Halstead brought Emma to Clara, and she nursed her daughter in the chair beside James's bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, counting each breath like a prayer. When Emma fell asleep, Mrs. Halstead took her. "I'll keep her in my room tonight. You focus on him." Clara pulled the chair closer to the bed and took James's hand. His fingers were warm now, no longer cold with shock. In sleep, his face looked younger, the hard lines softened. She studied him, this man who'd stepped into a disaster of a life and refused to step back out, who'd built her daughter a crib and faced down a mob and taken a bullet that should have been hers. Why? She whispered to his sleeping form. Why would you do all this for a stranger? But even as she asked, she knew. Because he'd failed to save Catherine and their child, and saving Clara had become his redemption. Because he was the kind of man who couldn't turn away from suffering. Because underneath the gruff rancher exterior lived someone who still believed. The world could be made right if you were willing to bleed for it. Dawn came pale and cold. James's fever started an hour after sunrise. Clara felt it first in the heat of his hand, then saw it in the flush spreading across his face. She placed her palm against his forehead and swore softly. Mrs. Halstead appeared with fresh bandages. One look at James told her everything. Fever's not unexpected after surgery. We keep him cool and watch for infection. They spent the day in rotation, Clara changing the bandages, Mrs. Halstead bringing cool water and broth, Garrett checking in between ranch duties. James drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to drink, sometimes lost in favored dreams where he called for Catherine, for his father, for people Clara didn't know. Once he gripped her hand so hard it hurt and said, "Don't let them take her." "No one's taking anyone," Clara soothed. "We're safe. Everyone's safe. Promise me." "I promise." He relaxed then, sinking back into restless sleep. By the second night, Clara was running on nothing but determination and coffee. She dozed in the chair, jerking awake every time James moved or made a sound. Once she woke to find him watching her in the lamplight, his eyes clearer than they'd been. "You should sleep in a real bed," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine here, Clara. Don't argue with me, James Dalton. You're injured and I'm in charge." That ghost of a smile again. "Terrifying woman. You have no idea." She adjusted his pillow. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot." He tried to shift and winced. "That cussin' Caleb, he's young. Stupid. Didn't mean, I don't care what he meant. He shot you. Milton put that anger in him. Poisoned his own family with it." James closed his eyes. "Hate does that, spreads like fever, then let the law handle it. Sheriff Tackett arrested all of them right after the shooting. They're in custody." "Good." He was fading again. "Catherine would have liked you." Clara's throat tightened. "You think so?" "Strong, brave, stubborn as hell." His words slurred as sleep claimed him. Just her type. On the third day, the fever broke. James woke clear-headed and hungry, demanding real food instead of broth. Mrs. Halstead brought eggs and bacon, and Clara watched him eat with his right hand, the left arm bound tight against his chest. "You planning to watch every bite?" he asked. "Just making sure you don't overdo it." "You're not as young as you think. I'm 38, Ancient, she said, but she was smiling. He set down his fork. Clara, thank you for staying, for, he gestured vaguely with his good hand, all of it. You saved my life. The least I could do was return the favor. We're even then, not even close. She stood and collected his dishes. But we can call it a start. Over the next week, James's strength returned slowly. Clara changed his bandages morning and evening, her hands growing confident with the routine. She helped him walk to the window when he grew restless, supported his weight when dizziness hit, read to him from old newspapers when boredom made him irritable. The ranch ran smoothly under Garrett's management, but the men came to James's room each evening to report: cattle moved, fences mended, supplies purchased. Clara noticed how they looked to him not just for orders, but for something else. Reassurance maybe that their world would continue steady despite everything. Emma learned to crawl during those weeks. Clara brought her to James's room each afternoon, and the baby would pull herself across the floor, determined and clumsy. The first time she reached James's bed and grabbed the quilt with her tiny fists, he laughed a real, genuine laugh that Clara hadn't heard from him before. She's relentless, he said, like her mother. That's what I'm afraid of. One evening, Clara sat by the window mending his shirts while he dosed. The light was golden, the valley, peaceful below. She thought about how strange it was that violence had brought her here, to this room, to this quiet domestic moment that felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived with Thomas. The guilt that followed that thought was immediate and sharp. She'd loved Thomas, of course she had. But their marriage had been built on necessity as much as affection. He'd needed a wife to help with the homestead. She'd needed security her family couldn't provide. They'd been partners more than lovers, practical more than passionate. What she felt for James was different, dangerous. It had grown slowly, like frost forming on a window, barely visible at first, then suddenly complete and undeniable. "You're thinking too loud," James said without opening his eyes. Clara set down her mending. "Am I?" Can practically hear the gears turning. He opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. "What's troubling you?" "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." She folded her hands in her lap. "I keep thinking about what comes next. The trial's over. You're healing. Eventually life will return to normal, whatever that means now. And you're wondering where you fit in that normal. The cottage in Ashford is still mine, technically. Once you're well enough, I should probably—" "Don't." His voice was firm. "Don't even finish that sentence. James, do you want to go back there? To that house where you killed a man? To that town that condemned you?" He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pull on his shoulder. "Because if you do, I won't stop you. But if you're only leaving because you think it's what you're supposed to do, then stop thinking that way." Clara's heart hammered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying stay. You and Emma both, not as a guest, not as someone I'm protecting, but as," he faltered, suddenly uncertain, "as someone who belongs here, with me." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. "You don't have to answer now," he added quickly. "I know it's complicated. I know you're still grieving, Thomas, and we're both still carrying our dead. But I need you to know that when I think about the future, about this ranch, about my life, you're in it. Both of you." Clara couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. Emma, who'd fallen asleep on the floor, stirred and whimpered. Clara lifted her automatically, settling the baby against her shoulder. "I was 20 when I married Thomas," she said finally. I barely knew him. My parents arranged it because his family had land and mine had debts. He was kind to me, in his way. But we never had what you and Catherine had. We never had time to build it. You don't have to explain. Yes, I do. She met his eyes. Because I need you to understand that what I feel for you isn't about replacing Thomas. It's not about gratitude or obligation or any of the things I can tell myself to make it simpler. It's about the fact that when you were lying in that relation, wagon bleeding, all I could think was that the world couldn't be so cruel as to give me someone like you and then take you away before I'd even figured out what you meant to me. James sat very still. And what do I mean to you? I don't know yet, but I'd like the chance to find out. He held out his good hand. She took it, careful of his injuries, and felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin, the steadiness that had kept her anchored through everything. "Stay," he said simply. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." "All right," Clara whispered. "We'll stay." The next morning, Clara woke in the chair to find James already up, standing at the window despite strict orders to rest. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting everything gold and impossible. "You're supposed to be in bed," she said. "Got tired of being horizontal." He glanced at her, and something in his expression had changed lighter somehow, as if a weight had lifted. "Come here." She crossed to the Jewish window. The valley spread below, green and living, the ranch already stirring. Garrett led horses out to pasture. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse. Somewhere a dog barked. "I never thought I'd have this again," James said quietly. "A reason to look at the morning and feel something other than duty." Clara leaned her head against his good shoulder, careful not to jostle the injured one. "I never thought I'd survive long enough to see another spring. And now I think maybe surviving isn't enough. Maybe we're supposed to do more than just endure." He turned and kissed the top of her head, a gesture so natural it seemed inevitable. "Then that's what we'll do." Emma woke crying in the cradle. Mrs. Halstead had moved into James's room. Clara went to her, lifting her daughter and bringing her to the window. Emma's eyes went wide at the view, her small hand reaching toward the light. "Look," Clara murmured, "that's home." And for the first time since Thomas died, since Wendell Cray walked into her cottage, since she'd stood in a courtroom and fought for her life, Clara believed it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. James grew stronger, graduating from walking the hall to walking the property to finally riding again, though his shoulder still protested on cold mornings. Clara took over management of the household with Mrs. Halstead, learning the ranch's routines, becoming fluent in the language of seasons and livestock and land. The hands accepted her presence without question now. Finn taught her to ride better. Moss showed her where the best fishing spots were. Even Garrett, gruff and protective, began asking her opinion on decisions. Emma thrived. She pulled herself up on furniture and took her first wobbly steps in the main room while everyone cheered. She learned to say "Mama," and shortly after, "Jay," her attempt at James, which made him ridiculously proud. Word came from Ashford that Milton Cray and his cousin Caleb were awaiting trial for assault. The town, embarrassed by the shooting and the revelations about Wendell's predation, wanted to move past the scandal. Several families reached out to Clara through letters, apologizing for their silence, asking forgiveness she wasn't sure she could give. She never returned to the cottage. Eventually, she sold it through a lawyer and used the money to buy supplies for the ranch. It felt right, somehow turning the place where she'd almost lost everything into the means to build something new. One evening in late spring, as the snow melted from the high peaks and wildflowers began dotting the meadows, Clara stood on the porch with Emma on her hip. James came up beside her, his arm no longer in a sling, though he still favored the shoulder. "Been thinking," he said, "dangerous Abbot, about us, about making this official." She turned to look at him. "Official how?" "However you want. We could just keep going as we are, you and Emma living here, us raising her together. Or," he pulled something from his pocket. A ring, simple gold, worn with age. "This was my grandmother's. Catherine wore it, and I've been carrying it around since she died, not sure what to do with it." Clara's breath caught. "I'm not asking you to replace her," James said carefully, "and I know Thomas will always be part of your story. But I'm asking if maybe we could write a new chapter. One where we choose each other not out of necessity but because we want to." Emma grabbed for the ring, and James laughed, holding it out of reach. "What do you say, Clara?" She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, frightened, trapped, desperate. She thought about the woman she was now, scarred but strong, grieving but hopeful, no longer just surviving but living. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm against her skin. Then he kissed her, not the tentative kiss of people still figuring each other out, but the sure kiss of two people who'd already been through the worst and chosen to stay. Emma laughed and clapped her hands, delighted by something she didn't understand, but sensed was important. And in the valley below, as the sun set and the mountains turned purple with shadow, the ranch lights flickered on one by one, small beacons of warmth against the coming night, promising that home was more than a place. It was people who refused to let you face the darkness alone. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, at the man beside her, at the daughter in her arms, and felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Peace. Not the fragile peace of temporary safety, but the deep peace of knowing that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. They'd built something here in the shadow of tragedy, something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth believing in. And that, she realized, was more than survival. That was grace. Summer came to the valley with a gentleness that felt like absolution. The meadows exploded with lupine and Indian paintbrush, the creek ran clear and cold, and the cattle grazed fat on new grass. Clara stood in the garden she'd planted behind the house, rows of tomatoes, beans, and the sweet peas her mother had loved, and felt the sun warm on her shoulders. Emma tottered between the plants, stopping to examine beetles and pull at weeds with more enthusiasm than effectiveness. "You're making more work than you're helping," Clara said, but she was smiling. Emma looked up, dirt smudged across her cheek, and grinned. At 14 months, she was fearless and curious, with Thomas's stubborn determination and something else, a confidence that came from never doubting. She was loved. James emerged from the barn, Garrett beside him, both men deep in conversation about rotating pastures. When James spotted Clara and Emma in the garden, something in his expression softened. He said something to Garrett, who nodded and headed toward the bunkhouse. Then James crossed the yard to the garden fence. "Making progress?" he asked. "Emma's discovered worms. We may be here all day." He leaned against the fence, his shoulder fully healed now, though he still rolled it sometimes when rain was coming. "Preacher Williams sent word. He can do the ceremony next Sunday if we're ready." They'd decided on a small wedding, nothing grand, nothing that would draw attention from Ashford or anywhere else. Just the ranch family, a few neighbors, and the man who'd blessed their home months ago. "I'm ready," Clara said. "Are you?" "Been ready since the day you said yes." He opened the gate and stepped into the garden, scooping Emma up before she could eat a handful of dirt. "What about you, little one? You ready to make this official?" Emma grabbed his nose and laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Clara and Mrs. Halstead sat in the kitchen, going through a trunk that had belonged to Catherine. Mrs. Halstead had offered it weeks ago, saying Catherine would want her things used rather than gathering dust. "She was about your size," Mrs. Halstead said, lifting out a dress of cream-colored silk, simple but elegant. "She wore this to her cousin's wedding, never had occasion to wear it again." Clara ran her fingers over the fabric. "Are you sure? It seems she'd be glad." Mrs. Halstead's voice was firm. Catherine believed things should be used for living, not locked away as monuments to the dead. Besides, she smiled, Mr. Dalton's happiness would matter to her more than any dress. Clara held the dress up to herself. It would need minor alterations, but it would fit. "Thank you for this, for everything. You've given him back his life. That's enough, thanks." The week before the wedding, 3 letters arrived. The first was from Margaret Hollis, saying she'd closed on the sale of her store and was moving east to live with her sister. She thanked Clara for her courage and enclosed a recipe for apple butter for your new life. The second was from Benjamin Thorne, informing them that Milton Cray had been sentenced to 2 years in territorial prison for conspiracy to assault, while his cousin Caleb got 5 years for pulling the trigger. The Cray family's influence in Ashford had collapsed entirely. Several families had defaulted on loans without consequence, and the town was slowly learning to function without the weight of that particular fear. The third letter was from Ruth Canfield. She'd heard about the wedding and wanted Clara to know that she'd started teaching again at the schoolhouse, a job she'd left years ago when Wendell Cray had made it clear that unmarried women who didn't cooperate would find employment difficult. "Because of you," Ruth wrote, "I remembered I was more than my fear." Clara read that line 3 times, then folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept important things. Sunday arrived clear and perfect, the sky a blue so deep it hurt to look at. Mrs. Halstead had prepared a feast: roasted venison, fresh bread, peas made with the first berries of the season. The ranch hands had scrubbed themselves clean and put on their best clothes, looking uncomfortable and pleased in equal measure. Preacher Williams arrived at noon, his Bible under his arm, and his wife beside him, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile. Garrett had built an arbor near the house, decorating it with pine boughs and wildflowers. It stood against the backdrop of the mountains, simple and right. Clara, dressed in Catherine's silk gown, with Mrs. Halstead's help. The older woman pinned her hair and fastened a single strand of pearls, also Catherine's, around her neck. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Halstead said, her voice thick. Clara studied herself in the mirror. She looked different from the terrified woman who'd arrived at this ranch months ago. Stronger, settled, sure of herself in ways she'd never been before. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty," Clara admitted. "Thomas has only been gone a year. Catherine's been gone 7, but still, guilt is for people who've done something wrong." Mrs. Halstead adjusted the pearls. "You've done nothing but survive and learn to live again. That's not betrayal. That's grace. There was a soft knock at the door. James's voice came through. Can I come in? Or is it still bad luck? Depends who you ask. Clara called back. But yes, come in. He opened the door and stopped, seeing her. For a long moment he just stood there, and Clara saw everything in his face: grief for Catherine, gratitude for Clara, hope for whatever came next. You're wearing her dress, he said finally. Mrs. Halstead said she was right. He crossed to her, took her hands. Catherine would love this, would love you, would be glad I wasn't alone anymore. I wish I'd known her. In a way you do. She built this place as much as I did. Every choice she made is still here: the garden layout, the way the kitchen's organized, even that hope chest in the attic. He squeezed her hands gently. You're not replacing her, Clara. You're adding to what she started. There's a difference. Mrs. Halstead cleared her throat. The preacher's waiting, you two. Save the sentiment for after the vows. They walked out together. Emma sat on Finn's lap at the front, wearing a tiny dress Mrs. Halstead had sewn. When she saw Clara and James, she skeeled and reached for them, and Finn had to hold her back with a laugh. Everyone stood: Garrett, Moss, Coop, Finn, and the other hands whose names Clara now knew as well as her own. The neighboring rancher, Samuel Burke, and his wife. A handful of others who'd made the journey to witness this. Preacher Williams opened his Bible, but before he could speak, James cleared his throat. Before we start, I want to say something. He looked at the assembled group. Most of you knew Catherine. You remember what she meant to this ranch, to me. When she died, I thought that part of my life was finished, that I'd just work until I couldn't anymore, and that would be enough. He turned to Clara. Then this woman walked into my life, not asking for rescue, not looking for easy answers, just fighting to protect what mattered. And she reminded me that being alive means more than just not being dead. It means choosing to build something even after everything's been torn down. His voice strengthened. So yes, this is a wedding, but it's also a promise that this ranch, this family, is about moving forward while honoring the past, about making room for new love without forgetting the old, about believing that second chances aren't betrayals, they're blessings. Clara's eyes stung with tears. She hadn't expected a speech, hadn't expected him to put it all into words like that. But he had, and in doing so, he'd given everyone permission to move forward too. Preacher Williams smiled. Well then, I don't think I can improve on that, but let's make it official anyway. The ceremony was short and sincere. They exchanged simple vows, promises to stand together through whatever came, to protect each other and Emma, to build a life worth living. When James slipped his grandmother's ring onto Clara's finger, already there since the proposal, but now blessed and witnessed, she felt the weight of it differently. Not as an obligation, but as a choice. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Preacher Williams said. James, you may kiss your bride. He did, and everyone cheered. Emma broke free from Finn and ran toward them, and James scooped her up between them, the three of them embracing while the valley rang with celebration. The feast afterward stretched into evening. There was music. Moss played fiddle surprisingly well and dancing on the porch. Clara danced with James, careful of his shoulder, then with Garrett, who was surprisingly graceful, then with Finn, who was enthusiastically terrible. Emma danced with everyone, passed, from hand to hand, delighted by the attention. As the sun set, Samuel Burke approached James and Clara with his wife, Helena. Wanted to tell you both it takes courage to do what you did. Standing up to the craze, facing down that trial, building something good out of tragedy. You've given a lot of folks hope that maybe the territory's changing, becoming the kind of place where doing right matters more than having money. We just did what we had to, Clara said. That's how it always starts, Helena said. People doing what they have to. Then others see it and realize they can do it too. You'd be surprised how far that spreads. Later, as the guests began to leave and the ranch settled into quiet, Clara and James stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Emma had finally exhausted herself and lay sleeping on a blanket nearby, Garrett's dog curled protectively beside her. "Happy?" James asked. "More than I knew how to be," Clara answered. She leaned into him, his arm around her shoulders. "When Wendell Cray walked into my cottage, I thought my life was over, that the best I could hope for was survival, and even that seemed unlikely. And now I understand the difference between surviving and living, between enduring and choosing." She looked up at him. "Thank you for showing me that. You showed yourself. I just made sure you had the space to do it." They stood in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when words aren't necessary. In the distance, an owl called. The creek whispered its endless song. The valley breathed around them, alive and enduring. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about the cottage in Ashford, about using that money for something other than ranch supplies. What did you have in mind?" "A fund. For women who need help leaving dangerous situations, legal fees, temporary housing, whatever they need to get out and start over." She felt him tense slightly. "I know it's not practical. I know there are better uses for the money." "It's perfect," he said firmly. "Catherine would love it. Hell, I love it. How do we start?" They talked it through as the stars wheeled overhead, how to set it up, who could help administer it, how to spread word quietly to women who might need it. By the time they carried Emma inside and tucked her into her crib, they had the outline of a plan. That night, in the room that was now theirs together, Clara lay beside James and felt the strangeness of it, being married again, sharing a bed again, building a life again. But it didn't feel like repetition. It felt like evolution. She'd been one person with Thomas, born of necessity and making the best of circumstance. With James, she was someone else, someone forged by fire and remade stronger. "You're thinking too loud again," James murmured in the darkness, just marveling at how strange life is. How it breaks you and then hands you pieces you never expected, and somehow they fit together into something new. He found her hand beneath the quilt. Strange is better than predictable. Most of the time. He laughed softly. Most of the time is good enough. The months that followed settled into rhythms both new and familiar. Clara ran the household with Mrs. Halstead, managed the garden, and began corresponding with women across the territory about the fund they were establishing. James worked the ranch, slowly teaching Clara about cattle and land management, including her in decisions that would have been his alone before. Emma grew impossibly fast, speaking in full sentences, asking endless questions, trailing after Garrett like a devoted shadow. The old foreman grumbled about her constantly, but was seen more than once carrying her on his shoulders and teaching her the names of different birds. In October, Margaret Hollis sent a letter from Pennsylvania saying she'd met someone, a widower with 3 children, who needed a teacher for their one-room schoolhouse. "I never thought I'd teach again," she wrote, "but here I am, with a classroom and a second chance." Thank you for being brave first. It made the rest of us braver. In November, snow came early, and Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told James on a quiet evening by the fire. Emma already asleep, the house settled and warm. He sat very still for a long moment, then pulled her close. "Are you is everything." "I'm fine. Healthy. The baby's due in early summer." A baby. He said it like he was testing the word. Our baby. Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely. He kissed her temple. And wonderful. I keep thinking about Catherine. About how you lost. Don't. His voice was gentle but firm. That was then. This is now. And we're going to trust that this time the story ends differently. Winter passed slowly, the valley locked in white, the ranch turned inward on itself. Clara grew round with the baby, and James became almost comically protective, hovering until she threatened to banish him to the barn. Emma was fascinated by her mother's expanding belly, pressing her ear against it and claiming she could hear the baby singing. Spring arrived with mud and melt and the first green pushing through snow. Clara planted her garden again, larger this time, planning for a bigger family. The fund they'd established had helped 4 women so far, small numbers, but each one a life changed. Ruth Canfield had become their unofficial coordinator in Ashford, quietly spreading word and connecting women with resources. The baby came in June, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made Emma hide under blankets. Doc Emerson arrived in time, Mrs. Halstead took charge, and James paced the hall exactly as Garrett said he had when Catherine went into labor. But this time, the story ended differently. Clara delivered a son, healthy, loud, perfect. They named him Thomas James Dalton, honoring both the man Clara had loved and the man she loved now. When James held him for the first time, tears streamed down his face. "I never thought." His voice broke. After Catherine, "I know." Clara reached up and touched his face. "But we get this. We get our second chance." Emma met her brother with great seriousness, studying him with wide eyes. "He's very small," she pronounced, "but I'll teach him things." "I'm sure you will," Clara said, laughing through exhaustion. That night, with the baby sleeping in the cradle James had built months ago, and Emma curled up on a mat beside it, refusing to leave her brother's side, Clara and James stood at the window watching the storm clear. The valley emerged washed clean, every color sharp and new. "We did it," James said softly. "Built something that lasted." Clara thought about the woman she'd been frightened, trapped, stabbing a man in her kitchen to save her daughter. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, through blood and trial and healing. She thought about Catherine's dress hanging in the wardrobe, about Thomas's name living on in their son, about all the ghosts that had made them who they were. "We did," she agreed, "and we'll keep building." Below them, the ranch lights flickered on as the hands finished evening chores. Garrett walked toward the house, probably coming to check on the baby. The garden she'd planted showed its first green shoots. The cattle grazed in distant pastures. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd survived, it was all here, solid and real and continuing. Clara leaned against James, his arm around her, and felt the full weight of what they'd made. Not just a marriage, not just a family, but a home built on truth and choice, and the stubborn belief that people could be broken and still deserve to be whole. The storm had passed. The valley breathed easy, and in the cradle, their son slept peacefully, unaware of all the darkness that had preceded his light. But he would grow up knowing what his mother had done, not as a source of shame, but as a lesson, that sometimes survival requires violence, that fighting back is not a sin, that women are not ornaments to be collected or debts to be paid, but human beings worthy of protection, even if they have to protect themselves. He would grow up knowing that his father had been a man who believed in second chances, who'd stood between the vulnerable and the vicious, who'd built things that lasted because he understood that strength meant making room for the broken to heal. And he would grow up in a valley where his mother's story was told, not as a tragedy, but as a triumph, the tale of a woman who'd refused to be a victim, who'd killed to protect her child, and who'd found a man brave enough to say, "Good, now I'll protect you both." Years later, when Emma was grown, and Thomas James was learning to ride, and Clara's hair had started showing silver, someone would ask her what she remembered most about that autumn day when Wendell Cray walked into her cottage. She would think for a long moment, her hand finding James's beside her, and she would say, "I remember the fear, I remember the knife, I remember thinking my life was over." Then she would smile. "But mostly, I remember the moment I realized my life was just beginning. That survival was only the first step, and everything after, the love, the family, the home, that was the real victory. That was what I'd been fighting for all along." And in the valley where she'd found her second chance, where broken people had learned to build something beautiful, the mountains would stand eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the truth that some endings are really beginnings, that some losses lead to finding, that sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to you is the door that opens onto the best. And that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to fight anyway, to survive anyway, to live anyway, and to believe that on the other side of darkness, light is waiting. Clara Brennan Dalton had walked through fire, and she had emerged made of steel. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.